Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about Ohio State winning that national title, their ninth as a program. Ryan Day's very first as a head coach, and he finds his way to the very top of that head coaching list. Maybe a touch behind Kirby Smart, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. But remarkable season from Ohio State that was all over the place, but it ends with a national title the way that they would hope. At the very start, the way they hope it would finish is the exact way that it did. But let's get into next year. Let's look forward just a little bit towards 2025 for both these teams because they're going to be confusing years. There's no doubt about that, but I still think they're in very good position to be maybe right back in this position in 2025. Who knows, but definitely back in the CFP. And we'll start with Notre Dame a little bit because that might be a little bit one that's an easier one to wrap your head around than Ohio State right about now. But for Notre Dame, it's CJ Carr time. At least it seems that it's CJ Carr time. Now, it could be Steve Angeli. They possibly could go out into the portal. Now, there's still a lot of people talking about Quinn Ewers. I don't think that's going to happen, but obviously that is something that will be talked about until this thing is settled. He is the presumed starter, though. CJ Carr, I love this kid. I think he's going to be absolutely incredible. I think he's going to bring a little bit more of that passing game to them, and they're bringing in some guys to help him out with that. Malachi Fields coming in from Virginia, excuse me. Will Pauling coming in from Wisconsin. The pass game could take a big time step forward. And also, Jaden Greathouse going into his junior year, going to be a very special player. As long as you lean into him a little bit more aggressively. If you don't, then he could be finding his way out in the portal. But that's something we can talk about in time. Obviously, don't want to speculate too much, but it comes down to CJ Carr. How ready is he to step into a void that is massive? Riley Leonard did things for this team that really cannot be equated just by what happened on the field. He was huge for this group, and CJ Carr's got to step up in a huge way. Now, he does have the backstop that is these two guys. Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price are set to be back in 2025, which sounds insane, but they are both Jeremiah Love only a sophomore, Jadarian Price a redshirt sophomore, so could find his way out, but I would tend to believe he will be back for 2025. Both guys that are just downright incredible, and they can be run first and really find their way to the title kind of a similar way they did this time. Now, CJ Carr is probably not going to be the factor that Riley Leonard was with his legs, but they should be right back in the mix, and these guys should be a huge reason for that. But it was a great year for Notre Dame. There's no doubt about that. They overexceeded my expectations at the very least as we went into this season, but next year will fall all on CJ Carr's shoulders, and we'll see if he's going to be able to handle it. But let's look at that schedule really quickly. Let's see what they're up against because it's a little bit tougher than some past years, and yes, somehow they only have 11 guys scheduled right now, so we'll see what happens with that. But at the end of the day, start the year at Miami, not going to be an easy one by any means, especially with CJ Carr against Carson Beck, two very different quarterbacks at very different parts of their career. So that'll be an interesting one to watch. A&M, the exact same way, and definitely will be a fascinating one where could get a little bit sketchy for him. If they're not careful, Marcel Reed could be setting for a huge year. And then you have the normal games. You have Purdue, you have Navy, you have USC in there, obviously, but you had a team like Syracuse, who's very dangerous. You had a team like Boise State, who obviously doesn't have Ashton Genty anymore, but will be a very good team in 2025. And then got to go to Arkansas, got to go to Boston College. This is not a murderer's row of a schedule by any means, but this is a fair bit tougher than what they faced this year, and definitely will test them as they head into 2025 because there's a couple of teams on here that could really be big-time problems for them, especially early in the year with those two games. You start the year 0-2, I don't think you have any more leeway. You should be able to lose two games and find your way into the CFP, but it's not crazy to think they lose those first two games, and then you're looking down a road that has just a number of landmines, whether you're talking about USC or Navy or Boston College or Syracuse. You're going to have a number of moments where you could lose where you probably shouldn't. You definitely don't want to start this thing 0-2, and you very well could. But the questions and how they will kind of define how they do in 2025, who's the quarterback is probably the biggest one, right? Is it CJ Carr? Is it Steve Angeli? Is it going to be another transfer quarterback? We'll probably find that out relatively soon. It'll be interesting to see what happens throughout spring, who takes over that job. If one of them transfers out at the end of spring will be an interesting thing to watch. But overall, it's going to be huge. Whoever it is, the standard has been set, and they better be ready to roll right when the season starts because you're starting with a Miami team that could very well be in your shoes this time next year. So you're in a position where you have to be very, very ready to roll, and that quarterback, whoever it is, very much needs to be ready to rock, and if he's not, then they could fall into a hole that's just impossible to get out of. And then you're replacing a ton of defensive talent, and not only defensive talent, but a ton of veteran leadership on this team that cannot be overstated how important it was for this team. Riley Mills, Xavier Watts, all of those players, even a guy like Bo Collins being on that team was massive for that group. It kept them intact, it kept them together, and in these moments, like last night, they were able to keep their resolve a lot because of that leadership, a lot because of those guys that stayed in this program and have really built this program up to what it is right now. You lose all those guys pretty much at once. So there's going to be plenty of talent in that defensive room. There's no doubt about that. But there might not be the leadership that you quite had this year because it's really hard to find the leadership that Xavier Watts, Riley Mills, Howard Cross, and all of Jack Kaiser and all those guys give to you. So it'll be interesting to see what they replace. I think the talent level will be more than fine on the defensive side of the ball. I think the leadership could be a question as you move forward and definitely will be something they'll be focusing on in the offseason. And then the tougher schedule. Will it come back to bite them? Obviously, you got 2 games that could get you at the very beginning, and then you just got landmine after landmine. They're going to be up to the challenge talent level, but it's going to be a fight throughout the year, and they're going to have to be ready to roll, because if they're not, then it could get ugly really quickly. But moving forward to Ohio State and what they have in store in 2025, it falls on this kid's shoulders. It falls on Julian Saint's shoulders. The all-in season ended the way you expect. A lot of guys walking out the door, with a lot of guys walking out to the NFL. Obviously, all the guys that came back last year, all the guys that decided to forego the NFL for 1 year are now off on their way. So Jack Sawyer, JTT, Emeka Egbuka, Travion Henderson, Quinshon Judkins, all of those guys are out the door. Now, you do return Carnell Tate, Jeremiah Smith, Caleb Downs, all of these guys on the other side of the ball that are going to be downright remarkable. So you got plenty of talent. It's not going to be an issue. The talent level of this team really ever, if I'm being totally honest. But at the end of the day, there are a number of things they're going to have to replace. I think Carnell Tate's going to be huge for next year, and I think they're going to have to get CJ Donaldson really up to speed very quickly in that running back room. A lot of questions. There's no doubt about that. A lot of turnover, but the talent level is going to be insane, and you might have the best offensive and defensive player in the country, and Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs as you head into 2025. So 2025 was a year that was always going to be defined by the result of this year. You know, you badly want to win that Michigan game in 2025, of course, but at the end of the day, you gave yourself a little bit more leeway. You know, if it didn't end in a title, if it was title or bust and they ended in bust, there would have been a lot of different questions about what this team was going to be in 2025, and there would have been a lot more pressure on a guy like Julian Saint as you head into that thing. But they're looking at the CFP again in 2025, and they got an interesting road to get there. There's no doubt about that. Obviously, start the season with that incredible game against Texas. We'll actually get into the first weekend maybe later this week because downright incredible what we're going to get in August 30th. But at the end of the day, that's going to be one that's going to be talked about a ton. Could be a toss-up, could be between the number 1 and 2 teams in the country as we head into this season. And then you do have a little bit of a lull. Grambling State, Ohio, at Washington is a very sketchy one. I think Minnesota is an interesting one. At Illinois is a team that I think is going to be really, really good next year. And then you got Penn State. You got at Michigan. You got a couple of games. You do avoid Oregon, which is very huge. But overall, you got some tough spots. There's no doubt about that. At Wisconsin's another one to really watch. So you should be back right in this mix next year, but you lose that Texas game, and then you're put in a really interesting spot where you got to beat Illinois, you got to beat Penn State, you got to beat Michigan, and then you got to make sure that you handle business elsewhere. So it's going to be an interesting year. There's no doubt about that. Ohio State has everything in front of them, no doubt, but definitely some big-time hurdles to get over, especially that first week game. But some big-time questions as we head into the offseason. Is Julian Saint ready to go? You know, the talent level is ridiculous. There's no doubt about that. The talent level of this kid is downright incredible, but there's a world where he's facing the number 1 defense in the country in the very first start of his season because that Texas defense returns Colin Simmons, returns Anthony Hill, returns a ton of guys on that defensive line, especially in edge rushing, and he's going to be under attack pretty much from the jump. There's no doubt about that. And you lose Josh Simmons from that tackle room. You lose Donovan Jackson from that offensive line room. So this kid's going to have to be ready to rock. There's no doubt about that. He has elite play callers. He has wide receivers. He's going to have running backs around him. But at the end of the day, if he does not hit his stride in spring, you might see Ohio State dip into the portal during spring. It's going to be a very interesting spring camp for them, but Julian Saint's got to lead the way. There's no doubt about that. If he can't, then you're going to look up at the end of this year and have end of next year, and have a ton of questions about what that quarterback position looks like for them going forward. Then you do have tons of players leaving for the NFL. 10 defensive starters are going out the door, and Emeka Egbuka, Josh Simmons, Donovan Jackson, Trey Henderson, and also, obviously, Will Howard are walking out the door and more offensively. So Can they continue to roll? Now, it's not something that Ohio State hasn't dealt with before, but this is obviously a little bit different than a lot of the things they've dealt with before. This is obviously a little bit more aggressive than some of the things they've dealt with before. So overall, there's big time questions about how you're going to replace that talent. There's big time questions about who's going to step up into those roles. Offensively, a little bit less of a big deal. Now that Will Howard to Julian Sayin transition is going to be massive, but the wide receiver group is going to be incredible with Jeremiah Smith and Carnell Tate. Obviously, the running back room with CJ Donaldson I think is going to be awesome. But there's a lot of questions on the defensive side of the ball. There's really talented players, but you're replacing just about every single player that isn't named Caleb Downs. So there's going to be a lot of questions about where they can handle it, if they're going to have the talent level that they need. They should have the talent level they need to get to the CFP. Do they have what they need to possibly follow this up with another title? Because that's very much on the table for what Ohio State is. And then you do have the Michigan conundrum. That's going to be a question all offseason. You weren't going to get rid of that last night. Now, you might have been able to wipe away some of the sting of that loss, obviously, earlier this year, but overall, you got to win that game. Ryan Day will still have this hanging over him as he heads into 2025, and he's got to find a way to win that game in 2025. If he loses for a fifth year in a row, and Michigan might be the team heading off to the CFP and not Ohio State, you're going to have a lot of questions. And a lot of this year will still hold on. There's no doubt about that. Flags fly forever. But the questions about Ryan Day will pop right back up. So that's the reality of that Michigan game. You got to wait for it for the time being. But it's popping right back up in 2025, and you're going to have to be able to handle it. There's no doubt about that. So you have two teams that are heading into 2025 with everything on the table. They could very well be matching up again, for all I know, in Miami at the end of the year for another national championship at the end of 2025. I don't necessarily expect that, but a couple of young quarterbacks really take the reins, and they got to live up to the hype. If these teams are going to find their way back to where they want to be, it's going to be those two quarterbacks, and if they can't step up, then it could be very interesting years. And both those places, a lot of guys rolling out, a lot of guys rolling in, and it's going to be a fascinating thing to watch in 2025 for both those teams. But we'll talk about that obviously in more detail as we get throughout the next couple of weeks, but let's get to some superlatives. Let's get to offensive MVP, defensive MVP of just the entire CFP. A lot of different moments I want to break down for you guys, so we'll do that right after this, so stick with us.